All right, well, now we're going to start probably one of the most important things that you can do in Python, which is to start defining your own functions instead of just calling functions like the print function that we did in the past. All right, so let me increase this, make it a little bigger. Maybe that's a little too big. We don't need to see all the stuff here, so I'm going to clear that out. There you go. Now I have a little bit more space. So if you remember, we did things like say is hello, and then we said person is Sam, and then we said something like print, and then we created a string, which was whatever you wanted to say, followed by who you were going to say to. We put a little exclamation, we did that, executed, we said hello Sam, and then we realized that we could go in and change the value to hi, and you can change that to Samantha, and you got hi Samantha. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to do this in a much more usable way by defining our own functions to compute that string. So how do I do it? The first thing I have to do is use the keyword def. Now, if you notice, it turned green. That means, if you remember from one of the previous lectures, that def is a keyword, and that should also tell you, please don't call your variable def, D-E-F, okay? Def is how you define your own function. So let's define our function. So we have to enter the name of the function. I'm going to call it greet, all right? Now, the greet function is going to take two parameters, and I'm going to call them parameters, and I'm going to try and consistently call them parameters when they're used here. And when you call the function, when you invoke the function, which we're going to do in a second, you're going to supply arguments. You're going to supply expressions as arguments that are going to be associated with these parameters. So we have to name these parameters. So I'm just going to call this, let's say, what do you want to say? So let's call that say. And who do you want to say to? Person. And then you put a colon. And that's when you say what follows next after this is the body of this function. The body of the function is the code that is going to get executed when this function gets invoked, when this function gets called, right? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with something which might surprise you. I'm actually going to start with a string. Now you might wonder, why am I typing a string, and that to why a multi-line string? This string is what we call a doc string. And a doc string, DOC, doc string, is nothing more than documentation about this function. You don't have to do it, but it's a really good idea to document your functions. So I'm going to document my function. I'm going to say what this greet function is going to do. But before that, notice something super important, which is the doc string, or the string, which is the first thing in the body of the function, is indented. Now, let me get this out of the way right now, because sooner or later I'm going to have to deal with this. And that is something that you're either going to love or you're going to hate. And that is that blocks of code, or code blocks, in Python are designated through indentation. So what I did here, and the editor, that's Jupyter Lab, was kind enough to do that indentation for me already. But you can see that there are 4 spaces between here, between the start and between where this starts. That indentation is what tells Python that all the stuff that's indented by those 4 spaces is a code block, right? If you've come from some other language, you might have used begin and end, or you might use curly braces or something like that to designate your code blocks. Well, in Python, you don't do that. You do it all through indentation, and the indentation is usually 4 spaces. Just by convention, most people use 4 spaces, and you should probably do the same if you don't want to annoy other programmers, other Python programmers. All right, so some people are either going to hate this or some people are going to love it. I absolutely detested it when I first started programming in Python. I must admit that I have changed my mind. I really like it now. I really hope that if you dislike it, that you'll be able to get over it like I did. All right, let's get back to the docstring. What is this docstring? Docstring is nothing more than documentation, and it's here that you say what it is that you want this function does. So for example, I'm just going to do something very simple and probably not very good right now, but just giving some informal description of what this function does. So generates a string that is a greeting to the specified person. Okay, and I can be a little bit better. I can say parameters, right? And I can say things like say, and I'm going to say that's a string, and what do you want to say? And then I can say person, that's also a string, who do you want to say it to? Okay, and then I can say returns, that's a greeting, which is a string. Okay, and let me. All right. Okay, so that's the docstring, and we'll see in a second why this is actually a cool thing to do. Now let's get to the actual body of the function. And in our case, the body of the function is going to be super simple, because normally what you would do in the body is you would take the say and the person or whatever the parameters to this function are, and then you would do your computation, and then eventually you would return the value that you want to be the return value of this function. Well, in our example, it's so simple that I'm just going to type in the return value right there through the return keyword. So this again is something that we saw in one of the very first lectures, where we were warned not to use return as a variable name because it's a keyword. Well, now you see why it's a keyword. It is the keyword that we use whenever we want to define the expression or the value of the expression that you want to return in a function. So in our case, I'm going to return a string because that's what I said in the documentation. And here's what I'm going to do. You've seen this before. I'm going to say that to person. I'm going to put my little thing there, and that's it. Now I'm done, and I hit Shift Enter, and I now have a greet function that is defined. So let's call it, and let's try a couple things. So first thing I can do is I can actually let's just call it directly here. I'm going to say greet, and I'm going to say hello to Sam. Right there you go. Hello, Sam. Now, why is this docstring such a good thing? Well, let me do this. And then I say Shift Tab. So I'm holding the Shift key down and I'm hitting Tab. You see that this editor is smart enough to go and look at the docstring and print it out for me so that if I forget, if I don't know what the function is doing, I can actually just look it up. So if someone else is calling my function and they're not sure what it does, or they don't know what the parameters are or what the types are, well, this is the moment. This is the moment for you to tell them. That docstring is the moment for you to tell them exactly how you call this function. Okay, so that's why this docstring is really useful. In the very least, you should at least have a one-line description of the function and what the parameters are. Okay, so now let's do something like, let's call it, let's say hi, and this time I'm going to use Jim, right? There you go. Hi, Jim. That worked. Now let's work on this function a little bit more. Let's go back to our function. Now let's make this function a little bit more friendly to use. So for example, I don't want to have to say exactly what the greeting is each time. So let me say by default, I want to just use hi. And even for the person, if you don't specify who it is, I'm going to say something like mystery person. Whoops. Right? So think about what's going on here. I've defined a default value for each of the parameters to the function. So I'm going to hit Shift Enter. And now, and let me clear out these things. And if you remember, the way I clear out a cell is by DD. So I just highlight the cell. I go to the cell. That's the one highlighted one, and I said dd. Okay, good. All right, so let's get back to this. So now I'm going to call greet. I'm going to call the exact same greet function, and I'm going to call it with Jim. What do you think is going to happen? Now, what I intended, of course, is that it should say, hi, Jim, right? But it's not going to say that. Let's look at what it says, and let's see if we can figure this out. Okay, so it's going to say, Jim, mystery person. Not at all what we intended. Well, we have to think about what's really going on when a function gets invoked. When a function gets invoked, what is going to happen is that the values of the expressions that you supply as the arguments to the function are associated with the parameters that are defined. Now, by default, what it's going to do is it's going to associate them positionally. In other words, whatever is in the first position here is going to get associated with the first parameter here. So what happened here is that Jim got associated with the parameter say, okay? Then it went on to the next parameter, person. Well, there was no second parameter here. That's why it took mystery person as that value, right? Now, what if I had said, hey there, as my first parameter, and let's say I did not specify a second parameter for the person. Well, let's see. Now it says, hey there, mystery person, which is probably what you intended, right? So positional association causes a little bit of a problem with default values. It works great if the first value that you're giving it, the first argument, is something that you do want to use to override the default here. But it doesn't work so great if the first value you want to give it is intended to override a later parameter, in this example, person. So how are we going to do this? What do we want to do? We want to basically use whatever the default greeting is, but we want to use it on Jim. Well, the way we do that is by saying, I'm not going to use positional association. I'm going to use named association. And so you can specifically say that I'm going to give it the expression Jim as the value to use, but I'm going to tell you which parameter to associate it with. So there you go. I've said that the person parameter is to be associated with Jim. Now, I have not said what the value is to be associated with the say parameter. And so hopefully it is going to take person as Jim. And since I haven't specified one for say, it's going to use the default. And that is exactly how it works. All right. I'm going to stop here because we've covered a lot of really important ground, and I want to make sure that this really is very, very comfortable to you because we're going to be using functions over and over and over again through the next several weeks. So let's recap. Def is the keyword. That's how you define a function. You then specify the name of the function, and then you specify within brackets, you specify all the parameters of your function. Optionally, you can give it a default value, and you then end this section with a colon. After the colon, you supply the body of the function. The body of the function is a code block, so you indent that, and typically you indent that with 4 spaces, and unless you want to annoy all the other Python programmers out there, don't try and indent with less or more. Just stick with 4 spaces. That's what most people seem to do. In the body of the function, the first thing that you do is specify the doc string, followed by the code that is going to get executed when your function is invoked. When you're done with your computation and you have the value that you want to return, you use the return keyword, and then you give the expression that you want the function to return. When you call the function, when you invoke the function, you do it this way. You call the name of the function and then give parentheses. Within parentheses, you give the values or the arguments that you want associated with the parameters of the function. You can do that in various ways. The simplest way is to give no parameters if the function permits that, and you will get the default behavior of the function. Or you can type in just the values, in which case the parameters are associated through positional association. So the first position is associated with the first position there. The second position is associated with the second position there. So you're going to get hi, Jim. If you want to overwrite that positional association, you can say, for example, you can say person equal Jim, and this is named association. And named association overrides positional association. All right, I will see you next time when we will talk about modules. I'll see you then.